All right, good day, everybody. This is Silvanus Wosu. I'm the Associate Dean for Diversity Affairs at the Swanson School of Engineering. And it is my pleasure to give you this presentation. And this is a graduate workshop that is offered to all first-year graduate students in the School of Engineering. It is required of all graduate students. It is something that we have considered very, very important. We've been doing this for over 18 years, and it has yielded some very, very good results, at least in terms of creating and supporting the culture of diversity and inclusion in the school. So it is very, very important that you pay attention to this workshop. The title of today's workshop is Enhancing Cultural Self-Awareness and Competency in Engineering Education. And this title will come alive as we move through the modules in the presentation. Let me also say that this presentation, at the end of it, you will receive a certification for completing it. It is also very, very important that you pay attention to all the modules. And I will explain that later. So when you finish this module, there are questions at the end that you must answer, and you must score 80% in order for you to be certified to having taken this workshop. If you do not score 80%, you have to take it over until you score 80%. All right? My office is in the Benedum Hall, room 127. The coordinator for the office is Mrs. Natalia Goodnow. So if you have any question, Natalia will be able to answer any question that you have. All right? So let's get started. I plan to have fun in this. I always do. And all right, so this is, so we have actually 7 modules that we're going to be talking about, 7 objectives. The first one, of course, we're going to create the theoretical base of this particular training. Why do we do this? Why is this training important? And then we'll look at understanding this whole idea of cultural awareness. The cultural awareness piece and intercultural competence is based on module number 1. It's based on understanding our theoretical base. And I will prove that to you as we move down there. Then we'll look at understanding what diversity is, what equity is, and what inclusion is. And then experiencing inclusion will be module number 4. Understanding and responding to microaggression, and also implicit bias in module number 6. These are 2 items that we have added recently because of the national trend in those 2 issues. And then we will culminate all of these by looking at module number 7, in which we will talk about valuing and promoting diversity and inclusion in engineering. And of course, we will conclude with a commitment to transformation. All right, so let's see how we go. So goal number 1, or module number 1. So understanding our theoretical basis. Why do we do this? Of course, we are engineers, and so engineers we love numbers. If you want to convince an engineer about something, give him some data. The data is very, very important to us. And so this training is driven by data, and it's driven by analysis of typical engineering students over the years. So it is not random that we talk about cultural awareness. It is actually based on data, and I will show that to you. All right? So our theoretical base is based on this developmental model for intercultural sensitivity theory, what we call DMIS. And this DMIS is really a framework of explaining the reactions of people to cultural difference. It's really a framework for explaining the worldview, the worldview, the orientation of typical person towards cultural difference. The underlying assumption of this theory, and this is very, very important. The underlying assumption is that as your experience of cultural differences become more complex, your potential competence in intercultural interactions increase. All right? So how can your experience become more complex? They can become more complex by you traveling, by talking to people that are different from you, by listening to people that are different from you. Things like study abroad can actually increase your cultural competency because you will be able to see other perspectives. As those experiences increase, they become more complex, your potential competency in intercultural interactions will increase. All right, so if you look at this, I have underlined the word experience. I've also underlined the word more complex. All right, and I want you to pay attention to this because these are some of the things that you will see in the questions that follow at the end of this workshop. So, experience, this is really, really very, very important. Experience that we are talking about here is not a function of you being an event. Let's talk about this workshop as an event. Let's think about traveling abroad as an event. Let's think about going out with friends for social outing. Let's consider that as an event. All right? Your experience, the experience is not a function of that event. All right? In other words, it's almost like walking through the four walls of the classroom and learning nothing. The experience occurs when you are able to reconstruct that event, or when you are able to adapt certain behavior from that event, or when you are able to create meaning out of that event. So I've given you three things that could occur for you to say that you have had an experience. Number one, you reconstruct the event. Number two, you adapt behavior out of the event. Number three, you create meaning out of the event. When any of these three things happen, you will say, yes, I have had an experience. Otherwise, you have just passed through the four walls or visited somebody and you did not gain much. If that happens, then it will not make your experience complex. It is meaningful only to the extent to which you use the experience, to apply the experience. Like I said before, being more complex means you have to intentionally seek to add your presence in an event, like study abroad, like attending workshops on diversity and inclusion, like talking to people that are different from you, like asking questions and seeking answers when you don't understand, being authentic, and being aware of your own cultural limitations and your own cultural self. As you intentionally add those things to your life, your experience will become more complex and your intercultural competence will increase. So, the structure of this particular theory, the fundamental cognitive structure of this worldview is that it has an orientation. It acts as an orientation to cultural differences in which they vary from ethnocentric to more ethno-relative worldview. And we're going to talk deeper, more extensive on those two items. We're going to define them later. But to save time, I'm just going to move on. But just simply said, Ethnocentrism is when you think that your own culture is better than everybody's culture. That when you think that your culture is superior. Whereas a ethno-relative mindset is when you define your culture relative to other people's culture. All cultures are unique. All cultures are good relative to people within that culture. So for you to say your culture is better than the other person, you are being ethnocentric. All right? So, to be more within this continuum of ethnocentrism to ethno-relativism, the more ethno-relative worldviews have more potential to generate the attitudes, the knowledge, and the behavior that constitute what we call intercultural competence. I'm going to repeat that because it's very, very important. Your ethno-relative worldviews, they have, when you develop that, I will show you that in a picture in a minute. When you have ethno-relative worldviews, you have more potential to generate the attitudes, the knowledge, and the behavior that will lead to intercultural competence. And here we define intercultural competence as follows. Our working definition, as far as this workshop is concerned, is as follows. The intercultural competence is your capability to shift cultural perspectives and adapt behavior to cultural commonality and differences. Or your ability to think and act in a culturally appropriate way. And that last part means that you have to completely understand your own cultural self. And I will tell you a little bit as we go along the story of my life when you come to this point, to put it in perspective. You have to understand who you are. Sometimes, if you do not understand your cultural self, you have the tendency to create conflict. For example, all right, the way you talk. If you don't, for example, the way I talk now, I'm shouting in American context. My children will say, "Daddy, you are yelling." "Daddy, you are yelling." I said, "No, I'm not yelling." He said, "No, see now you are yelling." I now understand what they are saying. If I don't understand that and I'm talking to somebody away from my culture, I'll be yelling and thinking that I'm talking. I'll be so passionate, and my passion is interpreted sometimes as being extraordinary. And yet in my culture, we tend to be more passionate. And so I have to understand that it is okay for me to be passionate in this my culture or have my voice, but in this culture it can be misinterpreted. So you have to understand your cultural self in order to be a better communicator outside yourself. So, how do you measure this worldview? Isn't that interesting? How do you measure your stage in this worldview, in this continuum of ethnocentrism to ethno-relativism? It's what we call IDI. The IDI is Intercultural Development Inventory, developed by Dr. Michelle Hammer and Dr. Milton Bennett. All right, this is a very, very data-driven, very high reliability instrument. It is a 50-item theory-based instrument that measures intercultural sensitivity. And we define intercultural sensitivity as the ability to recognize multiple perspectives on an event. Remember now, we talked about event. Again, I underlined it here to emphasize the importance of this construct of an event. The ability to recognize multiple perspectives on an event or behavior, to recognize your own cultural values and those of others, and to develop a positive attitude towards understanding and appreciating the cultural difference that promotes an appropriate behavior. In other words, it means being sensitive to the differences people bring into a group. It means recognizing your own values first, and then also valuing others, being sensitive to others' values. You cannot value something and then you devalue somebody else's culture, or value your own culture or you devalue somebody else's culture. You cannot value your gender and look down on another person's gender. You cannot value something important to you, but the same thing, when expressed in another person's culture, you devalue it. Then you are insensitive. All right? So the IDI represents a valid and reliable method or scale of measuring the individual or group cognitive orientations toward cultural differences as described in the theory that I explained before. Now, so what does it measure? Fundamental worldview, or we call it orientation to cultural difference. The individual's or group capacity for intercultural competence. Again, I redefine intercultural competence. All right? The IDI scale measures an individual's cognitive orientation to cultural difference within this theory from denial to adaptation continuum. And all of that will sound a little bit abstract now until I show you what that really means. All right? The beautiful thing about IDI is that it gives you the starting point of developing a training such as this. So over the years, I ran IDI to several students. I used to give IDI before you take this workshop. It's not cheap. But then I have done it over the years and found out that the average graduate student measures at a certain scale. And so I'm going to show you now what the average engineering student, where the average engineering student is placed. And so this training, this curriculum is based on the revelation from IDI. So it provides an effective guide in developing the appropriate curriculum. All right? So let's move on. So here is the scale. So you can see in this particular graph, you see you have a predominant worldview. You see the IDI scale on the left, and also the cluster, the interpretive clusters for each of those scales. At the bottom of that scale, you have the theoretical framework, the DMIS. So it goes from denial to defense, defense to reversal, reversal to minimization, minimization to acceptance, acceptance to adaptation, and integration of cultural difference. And I will explain all this when we get to, module later down the line. But for now, you can see that there is a continuum. Experience of difference goes from denial to adaptation. So let's look at what this scale means. So if you come to the IDR, you see defense and denial, reversal, minimization, and acceptance and adaptation. So when you come to denial, you have two clusters. That is the potential to be interested in anything about cultural difference. I don't really care. And people in that worldview tend to avoid anything that has to do with race, anything that has to do with difference. They only want to be around people that look like them. It is a monoculture mindset because they don't even see any difference except similarity within themselves. And then you have a defense where people defend their own culture. You see that happening today in this world that we live in, where people defend something that is obviously has to do with a difference or the culture, with whatever. People defend it one way or the other. Then you come to reversal. This is a situation where people begin to think about other culture better than their own culture. You reverse the mindset. And then minimization is a situation where let's all get along. Let's all get along. I will explain this in details as we move along. But that is the worldview, from denial all the way to acceptance and adaptation. And every one of us will fit into one of these stages of development. So you can see in the graph there, on the left-hand side, you have the graph skewed to the left, meaning that there are some trailing issues that people in the left-hand side of that arrow there are struggling with to move them forward. And then you also see on the right-hand side, you have some developmental issues that people need to add to their experiences to move forward. And then you see minimization stuck in the middle. My friends, it turns out, and this is I'll show you in a minute, that the average engineering graduate student is stuck in the middle. Is stuck in minimization. All right? So you see this denial from ethnocentrism to ethnolativism, going from denial to integration. So in this particular worldview, on the left-hand side, is a monoculture mindset. And we will talk in one of the modules to show that monoculture mindset as engineers do not lead to innovation. In today's world, in the 21st century, in order for you to innovate as engineers, you need to have intercultural global mindset. You need others' perspectives. You need a mixture of ideas. And for that to happen, you have to develop a better way of communication. All right? But the average engineering student is stuck in minimization. All right, so let me show you the result. This is the result of over 600 engineering students in 2 years. The average result shows, as you can see, in the first graph, the first scale there, so you see developmental model, the DMS dimensions, denial, all the way to adaptation and integration. And then you see the scale there, DD, reversal, minimization, and so on and so forth. So this is real data from typical engineering set. All right? So if you look at this, the first one there where you say profile, your own perceived profile. The beautiful thing about this is that the average graduate student coming into engineering school perceive himself or herself to have arrived when it comes to intercultural difference. They all perceive to be in acceptance. You see that? The first stage right there. They all perceive to be in acceptance. That's good. Because that's where they think they are. But when they took the test, when they took the assessment, it turns out that their real self is in minimization. As you can see, the next one there says, your overall perceived intercultural sensitivity is in acceptance. But your overall developmental intercultural sensitivity, their real self, is in minimization. So what does this mean? It means that the average engineering graduate student, I must emphasize, has a gap that needs to be filled. And that gap is between where you perceive yourself to be and where you really are. That gap is the reason for this training. The purpose for this training is to fill that gap. This is where you want to be. Beautiful. Unfortunately, there are many things you are not aware of yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with many things that we don't know about ourselves. And at this point, I will tell you a story about myself. You know, I had been the dean for diversity for about 6 years. When I got certified to stand in front of you to give you this training and to interpret this result. So I went through the training. At the end of the training, they gave us this test. And I looked at my result. I said, no, I know this thing. I'm the dean for diversity, for goodness sake. This is where I should be. I could not believe that I would score, that the gap I had was so high, was so large a gap. So I kept wondering why. So we needed to consult the trainers to find out, you have that one-on-one. So I said, what happened? And then he showed me my result, my real result. It turned out from this revelation that I was not aware of how I was so embedded in my own culture. I was so embedded in my own culture that I was not open to accept other cultures. So in other words, I had the tendency to think that my culture was better. See, I was completely, almost in denial. I was thinking that my culture was better. That's number one. Number two, I did not know that the food, that the way I was holding to my way of doing things, the African way of doing things, was holding me back, was a trailing issue for me to accept a change. And look at me now. You can see it affected me, right? I speak with deep accent. After 42 years in the United States. You know why? Because I refuse to change. I refuse to change my accent. I said, no, I got to hold on to my British accent. But you talk to some of my friends, you would not get an accent in them. But for me, I held on to my culture. And that was reflected in the training. It was reflected in my result. They showed me that I had issues that were keeping me behind from where I wanted to be. That changed me in the way I approach things. I used to, when I talk to people, I was not aware that I was raising my voice. I was not aware that my body language could be a nuisance sometimes, fidgeting my hand here and there. That training revealed that to me, made me to be aware of the nature of my gesture, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And also made me to believe my children when they said, Daddy, you were yelling. It was from this training. So there are so many things we are not aware. I can guarantee you, listening to me, going through this workshop, that you will discover certain things that you do not know about yourself. I can guarantee you that those things can change, can have a profound impact in your transformation, in dealing with people that are different from you. Okay? Okay. So now, here is the deal. So in this minimization that the average engineering student is stuck in the middle, what is it that is actually hurting them? Just like I asked myself the question. So now the scale breaks it down. So you look at the first scale, the average engineering graduate student is not on denial. As you can see, the denial is resolved. The first one there. Denial is resolved. They don't have any issue. That means that the average engineering student has a worldview, does not have a worldview that polarizes the group. So denial is not an issue. The average engineering student also is not in reversal. You can see the next scale. The reversal indicates a worldview that reverses us and them polarization, where them is superior. The average graduate student does not have that. It is resolved. But then you come to minimization. You can see minimization is not resolved. Right there in the middle. A worldview that highlights cultural commonality and universal issues. That's not resolved. The rest of them are pretty much resolved. But minimization was not resolved in the average engineering student. All right, so let's break it down even further. So now, what are the elements in minimization that are holding the average graduate student behind? So minimization scale has two clusters. The first one is the similarity cluster. The tendency to assume that people from other cultures are basically like us. That people from other cultures are basically like us. The other cluster is universal cluster. The tendency to apply one's own cultural values to other cultures. See? You see what is going on here? So the first cluster is greatest drag. The tendency to assume that people from other cultures are basically like us. Are they? Am I basically like you? Or are you basically like me? No, you are not basically like me. I am not basically like you. We are all different. And that's okay. So the assumption that we are all basically alike is a wrong assumption. It's a minimization assumption. In other words, you are minimizing the presence of difference. And minimizing the presence of difference is dangerous. You know why? Just wait for something to happen in the group. Okay, let's get along. We're all alike. We all like each other. Just wait. When a conflict arises, you see the group polarizes. You see them split. One person goes to the culture that he feels or she feels belongs to which he or she feels that belongs, and then another one goes. So that's the danger of minimizing, and we'll look at that in a minute. The universal culture, where the average student is improving, is doing better in that orientation than in the cluster in similarity cluster. The tendency to apply one's own cultural values to other culture. So that is where we are. So the average graduate student is in what? Minimization. Remember that. So what does that mean, to be minimization? All right? In minimization, you may be stressing cultural similarity and universal values in a way that can mask cultural differences, crucial cultural differences, by assumption of common needs, by assumption of universality of certain values. Those assumptions, even though they may look good, they are not very appropriate when you want to deal with cultural differences. Because when conflict arises, those things are going to be magnified. All right? So let's look at the implication of being in minimization. The implication is very, very important. Overestimation of sensitivity to global and domestic diversity. You think you are sensitive, but in essence you are not. We are all tolerant and colorblind. No! Wrong statement. You should not be colorblind. You should see color. You should see gender. You should see race. It's okay. Minimizing the presence of these diversities is a problem in minimization. The second implication is overgeneralization of similarities between oneself and another culture. Look, I take students to South Africa every year. This is very, very important. You go take these students to an African nation, complete different culture, and you go in with a mindset of minimization, the tendency is for you to think that we are similar. We are not. And it's okay. There's nothing wrong in us being different. The third thing is insensitivity to ethnic, race, class, and gender privilege. If any person has a privilege and is insensitive to how that privilege can be wrongly applied to people who are underprivileged, the person needs to take this training. That is minimization. All right? So these things are very, very important. And the thing about the implication of this is the last point. That when people are in minimization, a well-intentioned actions may be perceived and has been perceived in my experience in running this program as cultural imperialism. Power over others to dominate them. I have actually had students accuse the school of forcing this on them. Okay? They were using the power of the school to force them to take this training. So that is the implication of being minimization. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but this is how it frames the strategy for this course. So the training strategies to acquire skills at this stage is to define culture, to define race, ethnicity, stereotype, and generalizations. Understand what those are, because that is the lack of understanding of those things drag you behind. Understand the minor subjective cultural differences, such as non-verbal behaviors of communication styles that are implicit in themselves with biases and prejudices. Avoid excessive stress on cultural contracts. You are white, I'm black. You are yellow, I'm green. You are female. Those type of contracts can be in some set offensive depending on who is saying it. Expand your curiosity about your own and other cultures. Provide categories and framework for understanding your own culture. Understand the privileges of dominant groups. It's okay to have privilege. It's all right. That's nothing. I like to have privilege. All right? By the mercy of God, I have a PhD in engineering. That's a privilege. All right? And so, there's nothing wrong with that. But should I, because I have a PhD, and go and look down on somebody else? That's where the problem begins. So understand the privilege of a dominant group here, meaning all people with PhD could be dominant group, but they are not. Unfortunately, there are only about less than 25% or so that have PhD. But what about dominant group like the white group? Understand those privileges and be sensitive to how you apply those privileges to people who are outside those privileges. So you can see why we structure this training on cultural self-awareness, because that is where the average graduate student is, believe it or not. So this training is not random. It is data-driven to select this curriculum for you. All right, so let's look at this. So I want you to think about this. As you reflect on your own experiences, not only from this particular workshop, but elsewhere, as you reflect on those experiences with cultural differences, where do you think your primary orientation is located in the continuum? Is it in denial? Is it in defense? Is it in reversal? Is it in minimization? Where is it? Embrace it. Understand it. Work to actualize scale outside of that, if it is below minimization. If it is, try to move towards ethnolativistic worldview, because it will increase your potential for cultural competence. So as you reflect, also identify specific situations you have observed or been involved in which a denial, defense, or reversal was used. Be intentional about this. Nobody is going to evaluate you. Be intentional. We are living in a 21st century view, a global market. Unless you are going to graduate and go and work with your mom and dad in a monoculture. But if you are going to walk away from home, in this world, you need to develop a global mindset. So begin now to intentionally think about your view, your worldview, where you are. And thirdly, identify specific situations you have observed or been involved in which minimization orientation was used. Oh, let's get along. After all, we are all the same, and I will show you more of this in the module that follows. So I want to save time. All right, and so on and so forth. All right. So that brings me to the end of that module. So let's review what we have covered so far. What have we done? All right. So let me help you to reflect on what we have covered so far. So review and reflection in goal number 1. Number 1, remember the underlying assumptions in the DMIS. As your experience of cultural differences becomes more complex, your potential for competence in cultural interactions increases. Remember what makes experience to occur. When you can reconstruct, adopt, or create meaning out of that event. Remember that. Very, very important in that particular goal. All right? We define intercultural competence, the ability to shift cultural perspectives and adopt behavior to cultural commonality and differences. We also define intercultural sensitivity, the ability to recognize multiple perspectives in an event or culture, or ability to recognize one's own cultural values and those of others, and to develop a positive attitude towards understanding and appreciating the cultural differences. We also talked about the IDI and what it measures. the individual of the group worldview. And I showed you example of how that is done, especially taking example from students like you, the average first-year graduate student in the School of Engineering. All right? The IDI scale is very reliable. Goes from denial, defense, reverse minimization, acceptance, and adaptation. Remember what those are. Remember where you are. And so remember the implication that I have told you of being in minimization. They include overestimation of sensitivity to global and domestic diversity, overgeneralization of similarities between oneself and another culture, and insensitivity to ethnic, race, class, and gender privileges. All right? All right. So let's go to goal number 2. So this module is this is where we begin to develop the meat of this training. This is where we go into what I said before about the curriculum or the training strategies in minimization. It begins in module number 2. Understanding cultural self-awareness and intercultural competence. A very, very important module. All right, so we are now in goal number 2, or module number 2. Here we'd like to talk about the understanding of cultural self-awareness and intercultural competences. So here are our learning objectives. All right? This particular strategy is meant for you to acquaint yourself. It's meant for you to understand who is in the room, to become aware of your self-cultural identities within a group, their culture, the differences and similarities, to understand the categories and framework for understanding your own culture, and also from those two to increase your cultural competence in seeing others' culture from your own perspective. And most importantly, we are going to conclude this particular by looking at the sources of your cultural identity. All right? So, there's an activity that you're supposed to complete here, and you will actually complete that because as an attachment, we're going to move on. But in that particular activity, they're supposed to have 5 circles. In these 5 circles, I want you to think about that. Think about it in your frame of mind. Think about 5 identities, 5 things that define you. I want you to pause for a minute. Take a piece of paper and write them down because you're going to use them in the questions. The 5 things that define you. For me, let me give you an example. 5 things that define me. I'm a man, my gender. I'm a black man, my race. I speak with African accent, my nationality. I'm a short man, my physique. And so on and so forth. I'm a married man, my behavior. It can also be my profession. The things that define me. And when you look at those things that define me, I mix them up. Some of them you know by just looking at me. So some of them are visible. Some are not visible. For example, unless I tell you, you will not know that I'm married. I'm a Christian. Unless I tell you, you would not know about my religion. So those things are invisible. If I wear my wedding band, they are symbolic. They will tell you immediately, this is a married man. All right? So these are things that identify us. So within those things that identify us, there are some values that accrue out of those things. For example, my nationality as an African, me being a man, there's a value that my culture ascribes to me being a man. For example, as a man, also my religion ascribes to me as being a man, I must provide for my family. That's a value system. You understand? So each identity has a value that comes out of that particular identity. And the totality of those things is really, really what defines you as a human being. So think about, and that is also what defines your self-culture. So think about the culture to which you belong and their possible sources or characteristics. And on the sheet, list 5 best items from your culture that best identify you. On each of those 5 items, list at least 2 values or beliefs of what we hold to be true and to be testable that you learned or resolved from your culture. And the most important impact these values or beliefs have in your life. So what I'm trying to guide you to understand is this. It's something that, as we think about your self-cultural self, in relation to intercultural sensitivity and intercultural competence, it is important that you know how to identify who you really are. If you cannot identify who you really are in those 5 or more items, you need to start that right now. Because identifying who you are and the value that comes from those and the impact those values have on you, people around you, is really the beginning of your own your own intercultural competence. All right? So let's look at this thing here. So here you have these dimensions that you can use to begin to think about what defines you. In the inner core of this dimension is your personality. That is your internal dimension. Your personality, your age, your race, your gender. You know, you move to the other one, you have your age, your gender, sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. Your personality sometimes cannot be seen. They're invisible. But then as you go away from your personality, your psychological self, you begin to see things that people can see. Your age, your race, your gender, all of those things, with the exception of perhaps sexual orientation, may not be seen. They may not be visible. And then you begin to go outside. Then you see the external dimensions. Your income, your personal habits, your recreation, religion, and all of those things, they begin to take hold to define you externally. And then you have your organizational dimension. So the point of this, and I'll show you another way of thinking about this, is that you can look at your identity, the source of your identity, from your personality all the way to your external situations. So when you take all that, and I will encourage you, as you take this training, that piece of paper that I asked you to write down, I want you to think about the list that you have. How many things you put in that list would you say are concrete, are visible? How many things will you say are behavioral, that they reflect your values? They reflect your values. And how many things will you say are symbolic? Concrete things are things visible, like gender, for example. The color of your skin, your race, they are visible. Behavioral things are things like wedding band. They are behavioral. being a Christian. They are behavioral. All right? Sometimes those things are not usually visible. The wedding band can be visible, but they fall under behavioral. Symbolic, you see people with tribal marks on their forehead or somewhere in their body, or tattoos. Those are symbolic. And you look at those, they signify something that the person values. Sometimes people tattoo crosses, they tattoo many things on their bodies that is valuable to them. If somebody has to sit down for hours and have his body tattooed and butchered, that thing that he's writing on his body must be of value to him. Don't you think so? If you have to go through that kind of pain and carry it for life, it must be very, very important to you. All right? And then all of those things will help you to come up with a definition of culture. Why am I doing this? I'm just using this example to help you frame how you can define a culture in any setting. Whether it is in your research group or you go to some other place and you want to define the culture of that place, start by asking those questions. What are the core things that identify this group? Or just use it for yourself. What are the things that identify this group? What are the values from those identities? What are the impact of those values on the group or the individuals in the group? How are these values shared among the group? By the time you finish that assignment, you have a definition of culture. So let's look at, we're going to pause for a minute on that definition of culture, but let's look at some of the sources of your identity. So here you see race, you see ethnicity, you see social class, you see sexual orientation, you see health, age, geographical region, and so on and so forth, just like the one that we did before, a little bit more detailed. And all of those things are the things that an individual reflects. When you see the individual, he will reflect race. He will reflect ethnicity. He will reflect social class. He will reflect all of these things. Some you see, some you don't. Warning. Warning. Do not be presumptuous in identifying an individual. A lot of us have made that mistake. Oh, you are Asian. Oh, you are black. Oh, you are this. Oh, don't be so presumptuous. Let the person identify him or herself. Because what you think identifies somebody may not be what the person thinks to be his or her identity. Does that make sense? You see somebody, and all of a sudden, you presumptuously assign that person to a class. Sometimes, those assignments are prejudicial. They are based on your own judgment of people who look like that. I was in a training. One young lady in front of me. The young lady was just as clear as noonday, an African-American black lady. So in this particular segment of the training, I erroneously assigned her unconsciously, because everybody's, to be black. She said, I don't identify myself. She was not even seriously light-skinned, but she does not. She's mixed race and does not want to be identified as black. So don't be presumptuous in assigning identity to an individual. All right? So what is culture? I'd like you to think about the word culture. When the word culture comes to your mind, when you hear the word culture, what comes to your mind? What are the key elements that you would think the word culture embraces? What are some of the dimensions? What are the elements that the word culture embraces? It is very, very important. This definition I'm going to give to you is based on, it's an abstract definition, but it is based on what the activity that we did earlier. So what is culture? All right, let's think about this. A culture is a shared, underline the word shared, or emphasize the word shared. It's a shared, learned, symbolic system. You see, the article is a shared, learned, symbolic system. So what is the emphasis? The emphasis is on system. It's a system that is learned, shared, and symbolic. It's a shared, learned, symbolic system of values, beliefs, and attitudes. Another keyword, action word, that shapes and influences perception and behavior in a particular setting. So this is very, very important, that a culture is shared. The values is a system in which the values, beliefs, and all that kind of help to shape what those people are in that particular culture. The depth of our cultural worldview is typically defined by national or ethnic boundaries, sources, or affiliations, as we have seen earlier. So our culture, or my culture, refers to the culture to which I feel that I belong. I belong the most. Other cultures or different cultures refer to the cultures that I do not believe I belong, to which I do not believe I belong. So it is important that you know that when you say my culture, you are saying the culture that you feel you belong. Their culture, meaning the culture you do not believe you belong. All right? So here is the question. Is it possible that a person in culture number 1 can learn to belong to culture number 2? Is it possible for a person in culture number 1 to learn to belong in culture number 2? And some of you will say yes. Some of you will say no. The most important question is how? If you say yes, how? If you say no, how? I will hypothesize and tell you that the correct answer is yes. A person in culture number 1 can learn to belong to culture number 2, and I'll show you how. So let's look at the dynamics of cultural transformation. Let's look at this. The pathway toward multicultural competency incorporates 3 strands of what I call intercultural dynamics. 3 strands. And it is very, very important you know what those 3 strands are. So let's look at number 1. Let's look at the situation. So here is culture number 1 and culture number 2. Culture number 1, they are blocked. They are not mixing. Culture number 1 has all of its values and beliefs. It has its own system that are shared by people who belong to that culture. And culture number 2 has its own system, of values and attitudes of people who belong to that culture. They are different. And the question is, can they belong? And my answer was, yes, they can. All right, so what must happen in order for person from culture number 1 to be able to belong to culture number 2 and vice versa? Here is the answer. The first thing is you have to transform yourself. So it's called transformation of self. Exactly what we are talking about. Cultural self-awareness. That is the beginning of you being able to transform yourself or transition into belonging to culture number 2. If you cannot transform your mindset, yourself, your cultural self, you will have the impediment to be able to belong to culture that is not your culture. So the second thing that you need to do is you must transform the boundaries. You must make intentional effort to break down the boundaries. How? Get to talk to somebody in that other culture. Be bold to move out of your comfort zone to talk to people in the other culture. And by so doing, you begin to find out that there are things that you people share in common. That the things that you think you share in common are more than things you think you do not share in common. When that happens, boundaries begin to break. You see two friends from two different cultures, they are so loving to each other. They respect each other. They interact. Why? Because they found something that is so unique. Sometimes man and woman, they're able to even marry when those things happen. The third thing that must happen is that you must, you see, now the boundaries are broken. It's now semi-permeable that people from culture 1 can now move on and vice versa. And the third thing that must happen then is that the team is transformed. It is at that point that you have what is called multicultural competency, meaning that members of this team now put collectively now have their own competency. So this team, it is no more an individual competency now. It is the competency of the team to interact. It is a collective impact of the individual self-transformation that leads to multicultural competency, transformation of the whole team. All right, so in summarizing this, so culture is learned, and this stage is socialization between people in the group. Culture is dynamic, meaning that it is an ongoing process. It is shaping and reshaping itself, varying over time and place. All right? I mean, think about this. Think about my generation, the culture of my generation, and the culture of your generation. All right? We were from the same place, but it has changed. The music we used to listen to in the 70s are not the music that you listen to today. The language that we used to, all these things have changed with time and place. The culture is shared. It is negotiated. It is a convention. It is almost like a signed convention. Culture is transmittable. That means that it goes from one generation to another, passed on as a legacy from one to the other. It's adaptive. In order to survive, the culture must adapt. Society must adapt to changes. And it is very, very symbolic. All right? So let's look at then culture, how to begin to define culture in any environment that you find yourself. All right? Begin by identifying the identities of individuals in that group, beginning with yourself, the values and the impact, and then be able to frame the definition based on those elements that I just summarized now. So, I'm going to add that now. How do you then frame your understanding of your own culture, including your values and your behavior? How do you frame those? Is the subject of the next few slides. And I like this particular event, this particular slide, because it generates some very interesting discussion. In this slide, I'm showing you a picture. If you come to my office, this picture is in my office. If you look at this picture, all right, I'll ask you, what do you see in this picture? Can you describe what you see? Just describe what you see in your own words. You observe it, can you describe what you see? If you can describe what you see, can you interpret what you see? Can you evaluate what you see? Can you frame meaning out of that evaluation? So that gives you 4 elements that you must use to frame the value, in creating value in any setting. In any setting. Number 1, first, describe only what you see. Just describe it. Don't interpret, just describe what you see. And then we're going to use that picture to kind of demonstrate. Second, interpret what you think about what you see. Interpret what you think about what you see. And third, evaluate what you feel about what you think. That is, generate a strong positive statement about diversity or culture from your interpretation of the picture. Strong negative generalization of statement about what you interpret. And then the most important is to frame the meaning. What is the meaning of your evaluation? What does this really mean to you? So come up with a value statement about diversity, frame meaning out of the event. All right, so let's look at this as an example. So here is a picture. So you can see in this particular picture, it's a community that everybody is busy working. See? I just described it. That's what I see. That everybody is busy working. Interpretation. They are so busy that some are stepping on each other. It could be a marketplace. Evaluation. Generalization. That means this could be in a marketplace where everybody brings in something to sell, and people are, you can see some people are helping people to carry things on their head, and there is a community. And then you frame meaning out of this. The meaning I give it is like it's a global village where every member of the community is making effort. And here is my statement. Here is the meaning I have framed out of this particular event. I gave it a name, a global village. It represents a symbol of unity, community building, and the interrelatedness and dependency of its members. Our diversity contributes to the stability of a prosperous global market. That is my framing of meaning of that event. If you come to my office, you will see an engravement of this particular statement. It's for real. All right. So here you are, moving into a different culture as a graduate student coming from wherever you are coming from into United States, what do you see? The first thing that you will see is a different culture, a culture different from yours. You may also be coming from some inner land in the United States into Oakland urban campus, a different culture from where you are coming from. For example, for me, when I came to the United States, I came to one of the smallest villages. And I came in and I started wondering, is this United States or should I look for another place? There was a culture shock. But 3 things will happen when you move into a new culture. Number 1, or 3 actions that you must take. Number 1, the ability to navigate through that culture. The ability to navigate through those differences. The way they talk, the way they walk in the market, the way they do many, many things. That is called cultural navigation. The second thing is cultural negotiation. When I came to this country many years ago, I have to negotiate my language. Huh? What did you say? Can you say it again? I have to repeat and repeat before somebody could understand me. It's still happening today. So I have to negotiate my way around, negotiate my meanings, explain myself, explain the spelling of my name, try to negotiate the pronunciation of my name. I had to negotiate certain things. And thirdly, you have to adapt. You have to take the culture and adapt it. Not necessarily adopting it. You have to modify your own culture and have a blend so that you can communicate. So those 3 things are important. The cultural navigation is finding the right place of engagement across culture. All right? And this is very, very important. Most companies, big companies, most global companies, this is very, very important to them. The cultural negotiation is a critical culture-based communication skill for finding your middle ground between 2 cultures and is affected by cultural differences. I just given you an example of my language. And finally, the adaptation is when you learn to accept the other culture and to change your negative attitude to a positive one. These 3 things, as first-year graduate students, you are going to face, and very, very important. Very, very important. Cultural negotiation, navigation, adaptation across U.S. All right? So let's summarize all that we have done so far about culture. So we're saying that culture is interwoven. It's embedded in everything that we do and everything that we are. You can find our culture in it. Culture affects everything we do, including our assumptions about life and the world that we live in, our values, our attitudes, our habits of thought, patterns of behavior, and relationship with others. It is possible to select anything about you and relate it to your culture. And being able to appreciate your culture helps you to appreciate and respect others' cultures. My friends, what am I saying? If you can embrace and be aware of your culture, if you know what those cultures are, according to these summary statements, you will be interculturally competent to negotiate, to communicate across any culture. It is such a vital tool for us as engineers, for us as global engineers, I must add. Okay, so let's summarize. We looked at the definition and characteristics of culture and how our views are shaped by culture in which we belong. We looked at self-cultural identities within our own culture or group culture, the differences and similarities with other cultures. We looked at categories and framework for understanding our own culture, including values and beliefs, by using 4 strategies: describe, interpret, evaluate, and frame. Understand how to increase intercultural competency in seeing other cultures from their own perspectives. Understand the sources of cultural identity and cultural-based value system. And finally, we talked about the pathway of multicultural competency: transformation of self, transformation of boundaries, and transformation of the team. So now we are in module number 3. So far, so good. And I hope you are enjoying this as much as I'm enjoying it. Module number 3, understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion. You might wonder, why do I have to include this particular module? I included it for completeness. Goal number 2, module number 2, is one of the most critical, one of the most important. This is just an icing on that cake that we'll just finish eating now. So let's look at what that is. So the idea is to give you the framework on what diversity is, that is completely sometimes misunderstood, and equity and inclusion, what that is, and how they are related. All right? So let me just make a statement here. Is that when you are sitting in this room as a group, that every group contain visible and invisible differences, like we talked about before. One of the critical things about a training like this is the fact that if any member of a group feels like an outsider because some diverse characteristics the person brings to the team, that person will feel less able to participate. The person will not be able to engage. So the idea is of inclusion. The first part is diversity. The second part is inclusion, that we have to try to work together to make people to be engaged in the team. So it is sometimes easier to identify the conflict created by diversity than to identify the resources that diversity provides. So this particular segment is to somehow give you some understanding of what those are. Okay? So here is diversity. So when we think about diversity, think about it as thinking about a number. Who we are, our differences, our identities. You know, it is a measure of the differences and similarities in all aspects of our human identities, academic unit, curriculum, so on and so forth, in achieving the institutional mission, or even in achieving your own goal of coming here to get a graduate degree. So think about it as a number, defined by our differences and similarities. Then you have inclusion. The inclusion is how are we engaging and welcoming our diversity? Remember, first one is diversity. So here we are referring to the active, intentional, and ongoing effort to engage our diversity, our differences in people, in academic unit, and in communities in ways that increase value and awareness of differences. And this particular part is what is missing in all of these things. Diversity, sometimes we don't have any control of people mixing up. We don't have any control of who we recruit sometimes. But inclusion is intentional. It's something that we must do to make all of these people that come from wherever they are coming from to be engaged, to be included. And then equity is what opportunities are we providing to our diversity to reach parity. And so this is very, very important. It refers to the creation of opportunities and processes for historically underrepresented population to have equal access to and participation in education, education or professional growth programs. It is really, so when you think about this, while equity creates opportunity for everybody to reach parity, inclusion engages everybody, diversity brings in everybody. All right? Like somebody said that diversity is being asked to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. Again, emphasizing dancing there, emphasizing engagement. All right? So, those three definitions are important for us. Does it really matter? Does diversity matter? All right, so let's look at this. This is coming from Damon Williams, the author of Strategic Diversity Leadership. He says, if leaders have to have no framework for improving diversity or measuring our efforts, we cannot expect our institutions to achieve academic excellence. Again, he's relating diversity to academic excellence. And then here, diversity is so important that embracing it is an option to remain behind high global impact. And if greatness and national prominence in global competition are possible, then mere excellence is not enough. Equity and inclusive excellence must be an imperative institutional fact. All right? Does diversity matter? Well, let's look at President Lyndon Johnson. He said it is not enough. And this is I want you to think about the emphasis. It is not enough to open the gates of opportunity, equity. It's not enough to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. All our citizens, diversity, must have the ability to walk through those gates. Inclusion. We seek not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. He says it all. He says diversity matters. Equity matters. Inclusion matters. This is 1965. And then the Supreme Court Justice Powell says this: it is not too much to say that the nation's future depends upon leaders trained through wide exposure to the ideas and morals of students as diverse as the nation of many people. And I can go on and on and on and on. All right? None of us, it matters. It matters. And why does it matter? It matters because campus diversity, this is from research, promotes cross-cultural understanding and breaking down of racial stereotypes to improve the ability to think positively and globally. So campus diversity is one reason why diversity also. Student body diversity promotes learning outcomes. Workforce diversity encourages and ensures continued interest of young men and women to want to study engineering. So we can talk about so many things why diversity really matters. In higher education, I'm going to give you a list of things why it matters. Number one, faculty diversity is an essential resource for optimizing teaching and learning. Multiracial ethnic classes enhance education outcomes. These are based on research. Campus diversity is seen widely as desirable and as beneficial to all students and teachers. Racial and ethnic diversity increases the educational possibilities in the classroom. Racial and ethnic diversity has both direct and indirect positive effects on the educational outcomes and experiences of college students of all races, I must add. And many other things. This is just a summary of few things that I picked up from this particular resource. So, making diversity matter in higher education is very, very essential and is very, very important. People have been classified differently from ages to ages. In the 60s, people have been classified differently. Today, the same people who were raised was a comfortable but false classification of people. Dominant group hardly name themselves. They name others in relation to themselves. You can hardly find somebody in the majority class think about himself as always has a tendency to define others and never to define themselves. This is again based on research. Today, people in the dominant groups are becoming more culturally proficient in seeing diversity as a strength and growth. This is in the 60s. But look at what is happening today. We are beginning to mix up because people are beginning to understand that at the end of the day, we can all work together despite our differences. So these are names that have been given to people, labeling people, and so on and so forth in the past. And then you can see why some people don't like diversity because of misunderstanding. People have this erroneous idea of what diversity is all about. Some says diversity is equal opportunity. That diversity is affirmative action. It is not. Diversity is not affirmative action. As a matter of fact, if you look at all my writings, you will not find the word affirmative action. Because diversity is not affirmative action. If you do diversity work very well, you have more than accomplished whatever affirmative action was meant to be, but not the other way around. And I can sit here and give you an example of my own life of where diversity worked but affirmative action failed. But for a time, I'm going to skip that. Diversity is a compromise on quality. It is not a compromise on quality. It's actually, according to what we read earlier, adds to academic excellence. It adds to academic excellence because it brings in different perspectives into the group. And by so doing, it raises the excellence of academic pursuit. Some have also said that diversity training like this one is illegal. Don't do training for acceptable behavior. Absolutely wrong. It is not. Cultural competency is not about behaviors governed by law. It is about behaviors and actions that improve a person's ability to effectively and authentically communicate and interact with people perceived to be different. So it has nothing to do with law. We are not under any legal mandate in the School of Engineering for almost 20 years that I have been here to do diversity training. No. But we have found out that it creates a culture where everybody thrives. It creates a culture where people feel valued and respected. I've been here for many years and we have not really seen serious negative writings and negative things about people different from you. I'm not going to give all that credit to this, but it is very, very important. We do this for all freshmen take the diversity training. So it is not about any legal anything. All right? And just to prove this to you that diversity is not a version of affirmative action, here is just a parallel. Affirmative action is government initiated. Diversity is voluntary and it's organizational driven. Affirmative action is legally driven. Diversity is productivity driven. Quantitative is for affirmative action. Qualitative is diversity. This is problem focused. Diversity is opportunity focused. All right? And if you go down to number 8, affirmative action is exclusive of minorities. Exclusive of minorities. You're going to hire more minorities to meet affirmative action quota. Diversity is inclusive of all differences and similarities. Very big difference. And this is how I like to summarize this. Diversity actions are effective ways to take affirmative action. That's from me. All right? So, this is something very important to me. How do you communicate? A significant body of research on diversity work in Western countries show that members of dominant and high status identified groups typically display more aggressive non-verbal behaviors, speak more often, interrupt others more often, state more commands, and have more opportunities to influence. All right, this is way back in 1999 that this statement came up. But what I will tell you is that even till today, and we're going to end it with when we talk about microaggression and so on, you see these subtle ways of treating people who are different, especially when there is this implicit sense of superiority over people. You see people talk down, talk more aggressive, display more aggression, and so on and so forth. We will talk more about that in another segment. So, that's the end of module number 3. We'll summarize it by making few points. In this particular module, we differentiated the meaning of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in the context in which they apply, we identified dimensions of diversity in a group, in a work group. We're able to look at why diversity matters and how we can make it matter in higher education. Module number 4, experiencing inclusion. So we'll talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity. So how do you really experience inclusion? How do you experience the sense that you are being asked to the dance, according to our analogy? Our focus is look at intentional community engagement to build inclusive excellence and innovation. According to Fedman, he says that experience of inclusion is the sense an individual has that he or she is safe, trusted, accepted, respected, supported, valued, fulfilled, engaged, and authentic in his or her working environment, both as an individual and as a member of many identity groups. So in other words, a sense of inclusion is a sense that you are welcomed and that you are included, that you are welcomed, that you belong to this particular group. A sense of family, that this is my family. Anything outside that, you feel like you are an outsider. All right, so let's think about this. Let's think about these two extremes. The opposite of diversity is unity. So let's think about a situation where you talk about unity. You overemphasize unity and you minimize diversity. That will lead people in that particular group to conform. All right? For example, in the School of Engineering, we have 6 departments. If the leadership emphasizes, let's say, one department, let's say we emphasize mechanical engineering as a department, as a unit, and we minimize the other 5 departments, what will happen then is that we all will think like mechanical engineers. We will create a monoculture, a servitude culture in which everybody will want to think the same way. On the other hand, if we overemphasize all the departments, the School of Engineering, and we forget that the School of Engineering is made up of units of 6 departments, what is going to happen is that this department will say, you left me out. This one will say, you left me out. And what is going to happen is that there will be fragmentation and conflict. So either one of these 2 extremes does not yield us to innovation. So what do we have to do in order to maximize not only the individualism of each group, but also the diversity of the group? What do we need to do? So what we need to do is we have to reconcile, all right? We have to unify with diversity for inclusive integration. We also have to diversify with unity with collaborative innovation. That means the following. So we have to somehow unify with diversity so that we can integrate our ideas into what the mission is. Or we can diversify with for collaborative innovation. When that happens, you have collaborative innovation, and that is what you call globalization. It is only when that happens that you will have what we are calling inclusive community. So, to achieve inclusive excellence and collaborative innovation at a point of convergence between unity and diversity. This is very, very important. In a system, you cannot overemphasize unity and leave out the differences that exist. Neither could you overemphasize the differences and you leave out the unity that exists. That will lead you to no innovation. Actually, will lead you to stagnation, conflict. The second thing, in order for that to happen, therefore, we have to intentionally adapt what Freeman has called inclusive behavior. What does that mean? Acknowledge, connect, and engage with others. Listen deeply and carefully. Learn to engage a broad range of perspectives so that you can enhance a better decision making. Openly share information and not to hoard it. Seek clarity and openness to have information needed to build trust. Be curious. Be curious. Ask questions. Those are inclusive. You want to be included. You want to be engaged. Be curious. Intentionally be curious. Become comfortable with discomfort. That means leaning into discomfort enables you to take risk and to speak the truth to enable more authenticity and connection. Step out of your comfort zone to know what others are doing. Don't be an island, in other words. Increase your self-awareness. Know who you are. Be willing to learn and be influenced by others. In other words, be humble. Be humble. Be respectful and demonstrate fairness so that people feel that they are valued and treated with dignity, respect, and fairness. And finally, foster interdependence and teamwork. These are just few examples of inclusive behavior. Be honest. Treat people with respect. Engage people. Intentionally step out and engage people. Communicate with people. All right? So, the thing is this. Inclusive behaviors start from your mindset. It starts from the way you think. If you think positively, inclusive, to be inclusive, it will lead to inclusive behavior. Let me give you an example. All right? This is what I call the mind center. The mind center. It begins with the way we think. The way we think generates emotions from those thinking, positive or negative, depending on that initial thought. The emotions generate desires. Desires generate actions, good or bad. The actions, when repeated, become habit. The habit, when it shapes your personality, it becomes a behavior. And when it shapes you deeply, it defines your character. And so, cultural competence and inclusivity became with your good thoughts about others. Think about others. Don't be presumptuous about others. The more positive you think about somebody, the more and act on those positive thoughts, it gives you positive emotions and desires to want to know them well. Action to want to help them. It becomes your way of habit. It becomes the habit of your mind, which then becomes the way you behave under those circumstances. All of a sudden, it becomes your second nature. The same thing happens when it comes to prejudice. It starts from the way you think, your thought process. If you think the cup is half empty, you look at an individual that walks into your lab, and you think about that person to be half empty, to be inferior to you, you will unconsciously act negatively towards that person. If you think you are superior, you are a dominant group towards somebody, you will, just like the thing I read before, you will, when you talk to the person, you find out that your voice is going up because you think you are superior. And sometimes it's unconscious. Be self-aware of what those are. Okay, how is this important? This is very, very important in the next segment of this particular module. Very, very important in strengthening a diverse community, let's say in your research team as graduate students. A community, your research group of people with a common background, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, industrial, whatever engineering field, it's a common background. You are in one department. Your bachelor's degree might be from another, but you are now in chemical engineering. Or you have a shared interest in that particular department to get your PhD or your master's. This community do not happen spontaneously. They are intentionally built and developed and nurtured by leaders who understand how to give power and authority to the members of the community. You can be that leader too as graduate students. Members of this particular community must balance the diversity within the community with the vision that brings together people of good faith to create something new. You become the person that leads the effort to make to strengthen your community. That's what this is all about in your research group. So if I ask you now, what are the 3 ways that these goals can be accomplished? What will you tell me? What are the 3 ways that you, listening to me, can accomplish these goals of intentionally nurturing a community, or giving power and authority to members of the community, or balancing the diversity with what are the ways that you can do that. I'll show you this. Number one, think about linkages between the mission and the practices of the community. What is the mission? Their mission is to graduate, do your research and graduate, and work with your professor to graduate within your research group. What does that mean? That means the ability to speak the language of others in the community. It means intercultural or inter-community communication within the group. Share information. All of members of the group, they have one goal. The goal is for you to get your PhD or your master's degree. Nobody is competing. You get your PhD, there's no competition between you and that other person. So you work together as a group. Speak the language of the research. Help each other to be successful. When somebody is not doing anything right, be accountable. Be the gatekeeper. And say, Jimmy, hi Mary, this experiment, this is the way that it will work. And don't wait for that person to make a mistake. You are not competing. You are not in competition. The second thing is understand and deal with key challenges. There are challenges that arise in a diverse group. Every diverse group has challenges. These are three ways of dealing with those challenges. Number one, foster a respectful environment in which ideas can flourish. And the structure must have the flexibility to accommodate new ideas. So don't hold one idea, be a monoculture, where somebody brings in a new idea, it creates a conflict. No. Let new ideas come in and let it flourish. Let it not be a conflict. Second, capitalize on the strength of the group. No one is perfect. We are all different. So capitalize on the new perspective of individuals in the group. Capitalizing on the diverse strengths that different members of the community bring to the effort. And lastly, understand how everybody can work together in the various spheres of responsibility to translating ideas into action. That is what strengthens the research group. That is how you break down barriers, and that is how you can deal with key challenges that may arise. And thirdly, develop a community-wide culture that supports, remember culture, what did I say? It's a shared, learned system. So develop a community-wide, shared, learned system of values and beliefs that shape the behavior of members of that group. To develop a community-wide culture that supports the free flow of ideas, that encourages the collective effort of the community and recognizes the need for ongoing reflection and renewal. So these three things, okay? These three things, three ways that these goals can be accomplished. All right, so let's move on. The community goal is actually to foster that respective environment. It's to create a favorable climate for change. It is also to capitalize on the diverse strength. That is really the goal of what the team is. So now, so we talk about the three things to deal with those challenges. Now, I want to deal with the 5 things necessary to nurture and promote and advance the impact of these goals. The 5 things necessary to nurture, promote, and advance the impact of these goals. If there is anything you want to remember in this segment, is these 5 things. And they are? Okay, so these are the 5 things necessary. These 5 things here. Number 1, I call them the 5 I's. The 5 I's. 1 is community identity. The community identity relates to you having, members of the group having a clear sense of a place and belonging. It relates to promoting individual sense of well-being and level of personal satisfaction in the group. In other words, it's a sense that I belong here. This is my place. This group is my group. But that's not enough to nurture and advance the impact. You have to go to the next level. A sense of community inclusion, which is the difference that that is inclusion of the differences that make up the community. That is your intentional effort to maximize the strength from the diversity by engaging every member of that community. The opportunity, the fostering of opportunity for all to engage as part of the mission of that particular group. But identity and inclusion are not enough. They are not enough to nurture and promote this community. You have to take another step. Community interaction. This is interaction among members of the community to do one major item, to allow relational contacts, sharing of ideas, concerns, and information that permit members to know and communicate with each other, to know each other and communicate with each other. But identity, inclusion, and interaction alone will not advance the impact of these goals. You have to go to the next one. Community integration, in which each member's perspective and uniqueness in the core mission of the community are integrated. They're integrated into the mission. They become part of the mission. And then finally, this is the level at a personal level, community involvement. Participating and getting personal engaged more than identity, interaction, or integration alone. This is taking it to the next level. This is where you personally get involved. This is individuals actively caring about what happens in the community. This is about loyalty and concern and a sense of community ownership and decisions and directions. This is where you say, this is my responsibility. You are involved. See, you can interact without being involved. You can integrate your ideas. Okay, here are my ideas. And you don't know what happened there. But when you are involved, you are embedded into the decision, good or bad. When all these 5 things happen, then you have community impact. The community impact is the result from and is maximized by the active promotion of the first 5 I's. All members holding each other accountable for the performance, character, and culture of excellence within their community, and having a sense of collective impact bigger than the individual contribution. Very, very important. These 5 I's, identity, inclusion, interaction, integration, and involvement, lead to community collective impact. And then within that group team is team building skills. How do you build skills in the team? Skills for managing and resolving problems in the group. Number 1, must be able to unite individual diverse skills and interests into a common purpose. You must be able skills in technical and non-technical problem solving. Be contributory to the team. Be both a giver and a receiver. You don't always walk into the team and always want to receive. Always want to receive. What do you bring in that will make the team to be stronger? Understand the academic environments of your department and research group, and that means being self-confident yet humble, listening and learning from people whose value systems differ from yours. Well, let me just say that openness to collaborate, to make connections and network, that is one thing from my experience that I have found out, that a lot of times students are not open to collaborate as if they are in competition. And that is not a team building skill. You have to be confident in yourself enough and humble to learn that being open is not a competition. You are not in competition with your team member. All right? Graduate education is more than quantity. It is important for you to have a good working relationship with the members of the team. All right? So let's look at a summary of what we have covered in that module number 4. All right. Number 1, elements of experiencing inclusion. Building inclusive excellence and innovation by reconciling unity and diversity. We covered that. We covered understanding the 9 inclusive behaviors. The 9 inclusive behaviors, don't forget those. The building and nurturing strong, diverse community, the goals, the challenges, and the 5 I's for impact. Understanding team building skills and conflict resolutions. And that takes me to module number 5. Okay, now, so we want to look at 2 segments that were added recently. The segment on implicit bias and microaggression. And a lot of the things that we have talked about, one of the trailing issues that could be an impediment for somebody developing intercultural competence is implicit bias. And so it is important that we deal with that a little bit. So implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So you can see, to develop intercultural competence, which is based on really understanding of difference, when you have implicit bias against differences or attitudes or stereotypes, that could be an impediment. So it is a very important module for us. So, no, everybody would think that it doesn't have any bias, but we think we are objective. But research has shown indeed that we are shaped by a lifetime of experiences and cultural history that we talked about before. And so, culture being a very dominant in our lives can actually shapes our behavior, our values and beliefs, and also shape our thinking, our thinking pattern. So these things somehow affect our biases, the way we think. So it is then important that we recognize the unintended biases, how unintended biases can be reduced. Recognizing unintended biases can help reduce its impact, in particular when evaluating individuals, in particular when wanting to increase your intercultural competence. So this is a very important segment. There are key characteristics of implicit biases that I want to emphasize. 1, implicit biases are pervasive. That is, everyone possesses them. Even people with established commitment to impartiality, such as judges, still have a little bit of biases. Sometimes it comes almost like human nature. But your ability to recognize those is actually the key. All right? So implicit biases are related but distinct mental constructs. In other words, they are not mutually exclusive and may even reinforce each other. So, so implicit and explicit biases can reinforce each other one way or the other. All right? In the South, I lived in the South for many, many years. You see people more explicit in their biases. They will tell you, I don't like you. Very explicitly, they will tell you and call you names that I don't want to repeat here. In the North, the same biases can be very, very implicit, especially in the way people treat people. So, so these two things they are not mutually exclusive and may even reinforce each other. Implicit biases do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs. Sometimes they are just out there, outside our belief system, but they are there. So that's what makes it sometimes very, very complex. The implicit biases favor our own in-group, but can still hold implicit biases against other group. You know, so and then they are very malleable. That they can be gradually unlearned through a variety of debiasing techniques. That is where I want to emphasize the last one. In other words, you can unlearn implicit bias. One way of doing that is to understanding yourself, understanding that you have them. The video that we are going to watch in a few minutes when we talk about implicit bias will emphasize that too. All right? So, and so implicit bias labels for historical oppressed people. So you can see genetically inferior, culturally inferior, deprived, disadvantaged, deficient, different, and so on and so forth. These are labels that you have heard people use sometimes, especially when they think nobody is watching. And but these days of video camera and video recording, you have found so many things that come out. So be careful. So the best way is to expunge ourselves of some of these things, so that even in your unconscious self, you are still very, very authentic and not be implicit in the way you treat people. The labels reflect the power of the dominant groups relative to the norm set by the groups in power, and in such a way that their difference is reinforced as a deficit. Okay, so the difference that the minority group is then becomes a deficit. So the difference becomes a deficit, and so that is part of where the problem is. Any group or person can exhibit implicit bias tendencies towards other people. So this implicit bias has nothing to do, in my opinion, has nothing to do with race and gender. Anybody can have it. Anybody can have it. Any race can have it. It is just an unfortunate way of behavior of people, and so it clouds our judgment a lot of times and creates unintended conflicts. And so it has to be avoided. It is important to deal with it as much as possible. All right? So that's why I'm saying that this is a very short review. So understanding implicit bias and prejudice, we're going to talk a little bit more about prejudice. The 5 characteristics of implicit bias, very, very important, pervasive, related but distinct mental construct, do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs, favor our own in-group, and are malleable. So these are the 5 things that I want you to mention. And then lastly, understand implicit bias level for understand implicit bias labels for historically oppressed people. It is important to understand those and avoid as much as possible using them. Okay? Module number 6. This is the one I want us to watch the video. And I want you to watch this video. I'm not going to watch it, but in this training, you must click and watch this video. If you don't watch this video, you will not be able to answer questions that relate to the video. But this is about defining microaggression, the mirror image of implicit bias. All right? Microaggression is a brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial, gender, or sexual orientation or religious slights and insult to the target person or group. So that is microaggression. You know, from where I sit, for many years I've been in this country, I have experienced microaggression more than I have experienced anything in my life. You know, and people use slides to describe you. They use slides to describe your accent. They use slides to describe you in a very, very negative way. And it's real. And sometimes people who do this, they don't really think that they are insulting you. Sometimes they don't know. They are not aware they're insulting you. Like somebody saying, where did you come from? We say, from Africa. You speak good English. I mean, the person did not intend to slight you. But what he's saying is that he was not expecting you to speak good English. So that's why we must be aware of some of those slides. That it is called microaggression. A brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial, gender, and all that against people. Very, very hurtful. And a lot of times you do not know what to do. All right? So, there are examples on different forms of microaggression. There is micro-insult. There is micro-invalidation. There is micro-assault. Micro-insult, for example, a black male college student at a highly selective university is asked what sport he plays, with the underlying assumption that he did not gain admission based on his academic credentials, but rather his athletic ability. You know, and the person doing this, sometimes he knows what he's doing, sometimes he doesn't know what he's doing. He finds somebody at Yale campus, and he said, what sport do you play? In other words, you are on this campus not because of your grade or your academic credential, but because of athletic scholarship. Micro-invalidation. An Asian American professor is asked where she is from. And when she replies, Kansas, her student responds with, no, seriously, what country are you from? Suggesting that she was not born in U.S. Micro-assault. A Muslim student sits in a class where a professor makes Islamophobic comments during his lecture. And many, many forms of this that are in the video that you can watch. All right? So understanding the three forms of microaggression, micro-insults, micro-validation, and micro-insult. How do you overcome microaggression? 5 things individuals must do. Learn from constant vigilance of your biases. Be real about your attitude toward those that differ from you. Be open to discuss your own biases toward others and how they have hurt. Don't be defensive. Be an ally by standing against all forms of biases. Please watch that video and get full understanding of those 5 points. All right, last module. Okay, so this is the longest module, but we're going to make it the shortest because a lot of those things I have already talked about. All right, so module number 7, goal number 7, this is the conclusion of the whole matter. Valuing and promoting diversity and inclusion. All right? All right, so, and so we want to look at how do we deal with prejudice and ethnocentric behaviors. And so when you think about these questions, I want to ask you this question. Have you ever treated a person differently because of his or her religion, orientation, race, ethnic background, gender, age, or income? Think about that. Have you ever treated somebody differently because of any of these diversity variables? Have you ever avoided a public place because you weren't one of those people who usually hang out there? Have you ever crossed to the other side of the street when a group of a different racial or ethnic background walked toward you? Have you even formed an attitude, opinion, or feelings about another without adequate prior knowledge? And lastly, have you ever made an assumption about another person based on generalization about a group of people? Can you say yes or no to any one of these things? If your answer is yes to any one of these things, it's an element of prejudice. And every one of us has it. If you say you don't have it, you are not of this world. You are too perfect to belong to this world. I have it. There are places I don't want to live. There are some foods I don't want to eat. There are people I don't want to hang out with. Okay? That is wisdom. And prejudice against certain negative behaviors. I do not want to hang around those people. It has nothing to do with race or gender. So every one of us has element of these behaviors. So let's look at what research tells us about prejudice. Persons with high self-acceptance tend to have a low degree of prejudice. Understanding the process of prejudice and stereotyping can lead to more accepting attitudes. Social contacts between group members may reduce prejudice. Social class prejudice may be stronger than racial or religious prejudice. Did you hear that? Amount of time spent learning about a group is directly correlated with reduction in prejudice. These are basic research. And this prejudice can come in different forms. Let's think about blind spot, prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination and biases. Blind spot, unconscious attitude and assumptions. Prejudice, an attitude, opinion, or feelings formed without adequate prior knowledge, thought, or reason. Stereotype, a generalization of characteristics that is applied to all members of a group. Discrimination, to make a difference in treatment on the basis other than individual character. You see, implicit biases we have talked about before. Okay? So, the conclusion of this is our understanding of blind spots, prejudice, stereotypes, discrimination increases self-cultural competence. I keep stressing this word, cultural competence. That is the subject of this training. Everyone has a blind spot. I just said it before. Everyone has a level of prejudice. Blind spots can and do negatively impact relationships in and outside of school. And what some of the things that we want to do in this training is to help us to examine our blind spots, framework on how to examine our blind spots, and transform our vision of ourselves and others to make them more objective and equitable. So where do they come from? Where do prejudice, bias, blind spot, all of them, where do they come from? They come from missing information. When you are growing up, your parents give you half story, miss out certain things, generalize certain things. They also come from misinformation. Misinformation, giving you wrong ideas, and these ideas are planted in your mind. Sometimes cultural background, how you grew up. Perhaps you have not seen anybody different from you when you are growing up. And all of a sudden you come to the city and here are people who are different from you. Wait a minute, a cultural shock. Ethnocentrism. My culture is better, and all of a sudden you come in this melting pot. What am I doing here? What are these people doing here? The thought process, we've talked about that before. All of these things added in history build up to your prejudice. And so I'm going to take you through a series of slides, some of which I have talked about before, on this particular item, ethnocentrism, because it is so key. All right? We have defined it before, the belief in the inherent superiority of your own group or your own culture, accompanied by a feeling of contempt of other groups or cultures, a tendency to view alien groups or cultures in terms of one's own. Look at your own, and then you think others are really, really backward. Most people, not just Americans, prefer their own culture to others, but too much ethnocentrism can lead to distorted thinking, distorted mind view. All right? So what do you do about ethnocentrism? We must increase our what? Awareness, self-awareness of our own perspectives. We must educate ourselves on the perspective of others. We can show respect to tradition and ways of interacting that are different from our own. All right? So, ethnocentrism has stages of development. We talked about before, and I'm not going to emphasize them too much. But denial, what I want to emphasize is the way people in these stages think. People in denial believe that there are no real difference among people from different cultures. And I'm giving you attention to these slides without going into too many details. People in denial, there are two ways that individuals can maintain a sense of denial. Isolation. They isolate themselves from others. They avoid people. Okay, they separate themselves from others. So they intentionally erect boundaries, physical boundaries or walls between them and others. Sometimes emotional walls. You come to them as if you did something, but they are consciously avoiding you. All right? Those in denial might say, live and let live. That's what I say. Okay? I never, as long as we all speak the same language, there is no problem. And so on and so forth. You have this slide, please go over it. The second stage is defense. Here in this one, one's own culture experienced as the one true culture. Cultural differences, a threat to one's identity and self-esteem. There are three modes of cultural defense. One, de-ingration, that is, response to differences by a negative judgment or form of negative judgment solely to devalue the inherent difference. Superiority and reversal. These are three ways that people in this particular stage behave. When they are in reversal, they devalue one's own culture to assert the superiority of another culture. Those in defense will say things like this: I wish these people would just talk the way we do. Oh, they have told me that before. Why can't you speak the way we speak? Even though I am speaking their language, they are still rude to me. These people don't value life the way we do, and so on and so forth. People in this type of stage. Minimization, I've talked about that before, so I'm going to skip it and move to the other stage of ethno-relative stage of intercultural development. The ethno-relative perspective means cultures can only be understood relative to one another. That particular behaviors can only be understood within a cultural context. Okay? So in that stage, the first one there is acceptance. In acceptance, they acknowledges that differences do exist, are important, and should be respected. They are always the first to stretch out their hand, to want to know you, want to shake their hand. Those in this stage, at this stage, will say, sometimes it is confusing knowing that values are different in various cultures and wanting to be respectful, but still wanting to maintain my own value. See, when you are at this stage, it doesn't mean that your culture has changed. It just means that you are able to stretch out and reach out to other cultures while valuing your own culture. The more cultures you know about, the better comparison you can make. This is what we have learned in our study abroad program. The other stage is adaptation. To use one knowledge about cultural differences to improve relationship with people who are culturally different. Those in adaptation stage will say, to solve this dispute, I am going to have to change my approach. Beautiful. Beautiful. I can maintain my values and also behave in culturally appropriate ways. So you can see that all of these things are very, as you go into these ethno-relative stages, that they are really, really into a global mindset. All right? So I'm going to conclude this particular last segment by looking at how do you really, really value difference. See, we started by understanding, identifying, and building, and building, and building. So now we are coming to a point of really practicalizing all of the things that we have learned so far. So here we talk about how do you value these differences. All right? Now, one way is to stripe away stereotypes, which is the heart of prejudice, and block the ability to think positive about other people. Just expunge it out of your system. Intentionally work to relearn about the group that you have stereotype about. Relearn them. Try to know these people. Ask questions. You know, in those days, they'd say Africans live in trees, or Africans do this, or this group. They have this, trying to know if we stay there, why don't you travel down there and see if they live in trees? And go to some cities and see if you even see any tree. As a matter of fact, some cities you have more trees in the United States than you have in some African countries. I'm serious. Try to unlearn some of these things that we picked up when we were growing up. Learn to listen and probe for differences in people's assumptions. Suspend your own judgment to better understand the shades of meaning in people's behavior. When people, because everyone has an accent. Everyone has an accent. When you're listening to somebody that has accent different from yours, don't listen to how he is saying it. Listen to what he is saying. Intentionally try to communicate. Because if you concentrate on how he is saying it, you will miss the point. But if you concentrate on what he is saying, you perhaps will understand. Build authentic and significant relationships with people you regard as different. You will be surprised what you learn. You'll be surprised what you learn. So how do we process the value, the differences? Enhance personal empowerment and inner ability to accept, move toward, or embrace different ideas and perspectives. Explore, identify, and value differences. How? Listen actively, openly, and respectfully to others. And frame managing cultural difference as a joint opportunity. Opportunity to learn, opportunity to grow, opportunity to be very, very competent. So I have this principle that I developed over the years on the principle of valuing differences. And let's see if this makes sense to you. People work best when they feel valued. The word there is when they feel valued. Not when you tell them they are valued. When they feel valued. People feel most valued when they are included. And people who feel included, regardless of their differences, become fully empowered. And then you can imagine what happens when people are empowered. When people feel valued, included, and empowered, they do what? They are able to engage, to build relationships in which they work interdependently and synergetically. And finally, the result is increased productivity. You see, this is very, very important, especially for us leaders, or in any way you find yourself. How do you value people? You say you value them. Do you value them because you just give them money, you give them salary increase? You can do that and the person still will not feel valued. They feel valued by appreciating their contribution, by valuing them as individuals, by valuing them, respecting who they are as individuals, no matter what. Until somebody feels valued, don't claim you are valuing that person. Until members of your team feel valued, do not say that you value them. Oh, I respect her or I respect him. When somebody is not engaging in your group, ask yourself, go back to the beginning of this principle. Do you value that person? Did you include that person? Are you empowering the person, sharing power and responsibility with that person? Some people are very, very brilliant. They want to do something. And you must ask them in the dance. You must bring them to dance in the group, to be part of the group. So, to value difference, test yourself on this. Have you ever spoken against a joke that was racially, religiously, sexually, or otherwise biased in a group? Hey, James, stop saying that. That's not right. Have you ever pointed somebody out for making a joke that you think is not right? Have you ever attended a meeting whose members were of different background than your own? Do you currently have a good friend who is of different background than your own? For example, if you're an African American, do you have a friend who is Latino? Do you own a CD or cassette that has traditional music that is different culture than yours? Can you name 3 people who are not the traditional white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male who made great strides in history, education? I mean, see, I put that in red because that's a very common question. But the point is, be intentional. Reach out, step out of your comfort zone and try to know people who are different from you. You will be surprised what you find. All right? So, first one, how do I value? What is my process of valuing diversity? The second conclusion here is, how can I increase my cultural competence? Raise awareness of blind spot. Listen actively, and I have gone through that in a different setting. But this is what I want to say here, on this here, about team climate. Team climate. The workplace climate depends on 2 simple actions that you must take as you leave this hall today. Number 1, become an ally. That is, positive or constructive. Or do not become an adversary, negative or destructive. Because these are the two ways that this can happen. It will depend on you becoming an ally or you becoming an adversary. If you become an ally, you will be positive and constructive, and that will lead to positive team climate. If you become an adversary, that will lead to negative and destructive team climate. The choice is yours. And I hope you select the right one. So, where are you? All right? So, I give you a couple of ways where you can be. If you are an adversary, cultural destructiveness, do I believe in rights and privileges for dominant group only? Cultural incapacity. All right? Do I work to maintain rather than to destroy stereotypes? Cultural blindness. Do I ignore differences? By ignoring differences, do I apply the traditions and customs of a dominant group to everyone? Cultural competence. Do I recognize individual and cultural differences? Do I seek out culturally unbiased people as my friends, allies, and teammates? Cultural proficiency. Do I share what I have learned with others to make my school and society more welcoming and equitable? When you look at that, this is the picture you get. Okay? So you see here, destructive and constructive. So where are you? Where I am. Where are you? Are you in any of these? I will hope that you will be in this area and not in that area. You will be in cultural competence, cultural proficiency, or cultural sensitivity will be where you find yourself. So you are an ally if you educate yourself. You are an ally if you interrupt discriminatory behavior. You are an ally if you support and encourage others' knowledge and social action. If you initiate social action. If you you are an adversary if you actively join in a behavior that directly supports the oppression of any group. Or if you deny or ignore actions that support the oppressive behaviors, or if you recognize actions which harm others but take no action. All right? So then we'll review this segment and then we'll conclude. Understand blind spots, prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination, their definition, their sources. Understand the process of valuing, the principle of valuing diversity, the process of valuing diversity. Understand cultural competency and how to increase it. Understand how to increase your intercultural competency, and be able to define and understand ethnocentrism, its sources and stages. All right? All right, be an ally and not an adversary for positive team climate. And the second part of this training we are not going to cover. You have to go to the university website and take the sexual harassment test in order for you to get full certificate for this training. All right? And if you have already taken it, bring it to Natalia. She will give you credit. And so we don't cover this anymore. We used to cover it, but we don't cover it anymore. And finally, my conclusion is this. What have you learned today? Did I communicate what we started with? So I want you to make a commitment for transformation. As an individual, this is what I would like you to do. Identify specific strategies that you are going to use to maximize your strength in order to minimize the conflicts of those characteristics you have identified. Second, I want you to develop for yourself your behavioral objective for maximizing the strengths and minimizing the conflicts of your diverse characteristics. And lastly, I want you to be intentional in what you do. Be intentional on increasing your intercultural competency, because your competitiveness in today's global world may depend on it. At the end of this, you have to go back and take the test. Like I said at the beginning, if you have to score 80% in order for you to get the credit. If you follow the slides, you should not have any problem answering the question. Do not guess them. If you guess the questions, you will not pass the test. I guarantee you that. If you don't read the slides and you think you can guess them, good luck. Good luck. All right? You have about 100 and something slides. And so good luck on that, and thank you for listening.